Deep in the heart of County Derry, not far from the southernmost reaches of Lough Foyle, is the old market town of Limavady. It is built on the final stretch of the River Roe, right before it plunges its way into the Great Sea Loch. The River Roe itself gets its name from the Irish word rua, meaning red, so named for the gorgeous russet colours that can be seen in the waters of the Roe. And throughout its history, Limavady has been powered by this ancient river. It fed salmon to the town, provided fresh water, and drove the mills that fueled the booming linen industry that once dominated Ulster. For during the 1800s, rolling fields speckled blue with flax flowers permeated the Ulster landscape. And when these were harvested, the linen mills of the Roe worked tirelessly to produce this precious white cloth that was treasured above all else. And at the Roe Valley, just south of Limavady town, flax was retched in great pools, allowing it to rot and decay. Then it would be scutched, a process that ground and beat it until only the fibres were left. These were then spun into linen thread and woven into cloth on the great wooden looms of old. The linen cloth was then bleached white, a process which was originally done using the power of the sun. Great spiderwebs of whitening cloth were draped over the bleached green fields, like those that can still be seen behind the Green Lane Museum at the Roe Valley today. They were guarded by little fairy tale-esque watchtowers, where stoic watchmen would keep a vigilant eye on the thread as it was sun-bleached before being woven into linen cloth. They prevented it from being trampled by animals, or worse still, stolen by trespassers. For as mad as it sounds now, so precious was linen in those days that one of the heavy prices for stealing it was death by hanging. Limavady and the Roe Valley flourished during the linen industry, helping the market town become the bustling centre of culture and commerce in the Benevena area for years to come. But the name Limavady is far older than the linen industry. It comes from another time in Ireland's long history, a time that is at least part enshrouded in the mists of myth and legend. A time of chiefs and kingdoms long fallen, of ancient battles and heroic deeds. And it is these stories that we will look at today, to learn of the people of old who once populated this landscape, and to find out how Limavady got its name. For centuries, Ireland was under a kind of feudal system. The main provinces were divided into dozens and dozens of smaller kingdoms, each one just as fiercely distinct and protective of their land as the rest. The kingdom that spans Limavady in the Roe Valley was called Ciannachta, which is now known as the modern-day barony of Ciannacht. Its original name, Ciannachta, refers to a race of people descended from Cian, who was possibly the son of Áil Ollam, king of Munster in the 3rd century. Ciannachta spanned the lands from either side of Magilligan Point and much of the area surrounding Benevena Mountain. Benevena Mountain itself is called Ben Fuivna in Irish, meaning Fuivna's peak, while Magilligan is derived from the surname MacGilligan, a clan who must have once been very prosperous in the area. The kingdom of Ciannachta cut down through Benevena to Dungiven and Banagher in the south, which was once the domain of the great serpent League na Pastia, who I'm hoping to do a video about later in the year. And on its western side, as far as Boveva and Tanlacht fin Lagan, a townland which refers to the burial ground of Saint Finn Leganus. It now borders the baronies of Tir Ciaran to the west, Lochensholen to the south, and Coleraine to the east. And right in the centre of the kingdom flows the River Roe, cleaving the land in half from the Sperrin Mountains to the south right up to Lough Foyle in the north. But older even than the kingdom itself were the Cruithne, an ancient people that are said to be one of the first Celtic tribes to live in Britain and Ireland, possibly arriving in the British Isles between 800 and 500 BC. They take their name from King Cruithne, who may have lived between 442 or 476 BC. He ruled over much of modern-day Scotland, though at that time it was known as the Kingdom of the Picts, Cruithne's people. They were a colourful tribe of Celts, named by the Romans for their brightly coloured body paint, as the name Pict is derived from the word picture. The Picts were once a substantial pagan people with their own language and culture, and fought against the Romans in many great battles. However, they likely started to integrate with the other Celtic clans by the 11th century to form the Kingdom of Alba. The Cruithne of Ireland were also descendants of the Pictish king Cruithne, and once ruled over much of Ulster, particularly the areas around counties Antrim, Down and Derry, including the area around Limavady in the Roe Valley. This was during the time of Dal Riata, the great Scottish kingdom that once filtered down into the North Antrim coast, at a time when from the north coast it was far easier to travel by sea to the Scottish islands than it was to trek inland through the dark, dangerous forests that once covered Ireland. The name Dal Riata still exists today around the north coast, although its origins, like the great kingdom itself, have largely been forgotten, lost to the seas of time. This all began to change, though, following the rise of power of the neighbouring Gaelic clans. Clan is a Gaelic word that refers to family, although the word sliecht, anglicised to sept, was also used to refer to a family line. The Gaelic clans of old were all descendants of Mila Espania. He was a legendary figure who conquered Ireland in the ancient past. He banished Ireland's fairy folk, the Tuatha to the fairy hills or the Sea, and his people, the Milesians, would then go on to rule Ireland for countless centuries. The old Milesian families have the prefix Mac or O in their surname, which means son of or grandson of. And these families or clans were said to be of old Milesian stock, ancient Gaelic families whose ancestors have inhabited Ireland for centuries, since the bygone age of myth and magic. Many of these clans were also descendants of the semi-mythological High King of Ireland, Niall Noigallach, better known as Niall of the Nine Hostages. He was a formidable figure, and as High King he subdued all of the 5 historic provinces of Ireland, those being Ulster, Munster, Leinster, Connacht, and, most important of all, the royal province of Meath. He was even said to have attacked the Picts of Alba, the Saxons of Saxony, the Franks and Roman Britain. And from all of his great conquests he took a hostage, thus leading to the creation of his foreboding name. But even more numerous than his conquests were his descendants, as throughout his travels Niall had many children with a great many women, and when he eventually died, his innumerable sons divided and inherited different parts of his kingdom and set up clans of their own. And because of this, many of the Gaelic clans in Ireland can trace ancestry back to Niall, such as Clan McCarthy, McBride, McGuinness, O'Doherty, O'Donnelly, and McLaughlin. Even some of the great Scottish clans, like Clan Campbell, MacDonald, and Bruce, also claim to be of this fearsome bloodline, scions of this mythical Irish High King of Tara from an age long lost to myth and story. Niall's Irish descendants are mostly comprised of the northern O'Neill territories in Ulster or the southern O'Neill territories in Meath. The northern territories were primarily ruled over by 2 dynasties, established by 2 of Niall's most powerful sons. One of these was Conall Golban, who established the O'Donnell dynasty, Their kingdom was called Tyrone, meaning Connell's land, and comprises much of modern-day Donegal. In a previous video, we met with Eve Dove O'Donnell, one of the chiefs of this ancient clan. In that story, he was visited by the mischievous sea god McQuillan, and sure enough, shenanigans rightly ensued. If you want to learn more about him and that famous Celtic god, then feel free to check out that video on the channel. The other of Niall's sons was Owen, who gave his name to the Donegal peninsula known as Inishowen, and to County Tyrone, which in Irish is Tyrone, Owen's land. Owen established one of the most powerful Gaelic dynasties in the whole of Ireland, that of the O'Neills. They proved to be just as irrepressible as their formidable ancestor, and quickly began to spread all around northern Ulster. Their huge kingdom eventually spanned the counties of Derry, Tyrone, and parts of Fermanagh and Donegal too. The poor Cruithne could not compete with their expanding military might and were forced to retreat eastwards. Their people were amalgamated into that Scottish kingdom of Dalriada. And as years went by, tale of them began to fade away into obscurity, just like their Pictish kinsmen in Alba. But, like many of the old peoples, their name lives on in the land that was once their home. In Benevenna's shadow, the townland of Cruithne is derived from the Irish Cruithne, meaning fort of the Cruithne, while in neighbouring Coleraine there is the townland of Drumcroon, which means ridge of the Cruithne. And so it was that the lands of the Cruithne were forfeited to the Gaelic clans, who then began to spread into the Ulster kingdoms under the leadership of Clan O'Neill. The kingdom of Ciannachta was originally bestowed to the O'Conquerors in the early 11th century, perhaps better known by their anglicised name of O'Connor. The O'Conquerors ruled over Ciannachta for about a century before they too were ousted out of their land by another Gaelic clan. This was Clan O'Cahan, who are also known by some as Clan O'Kane or Keen, which are still very common surnames in the area. There are many stories of Clan O'Cahan from around the Benevenna area, one of the most prevalent of which being that of young Finvola O'Cahan, the gem of the Roe. She inspired the song of the same name, composed by her brother Toll O'Cahan, following her untimely death on the Scottish island of Islay after marrying Angus Og MacDonald. But that's a story for another time, and a good one at that. The O'Cahans were another clan of the northern O'Neill and were descendants of Niall. Their principal seat was at Dungiven, which in Irish is Dungiven, meaning Gavin's fort. Much of their household and strength resided here, but a good few did venture north into the scenic valley of the Roe, near modern-day Limavady. And it was on this hill that the O'Cahans made their Limavady home, in the old fortress of O'Cahan's Castle. And even though the castle itself is long gone, you can still visit the site where it once stood, hidden in a copse of trees and perched high over the great russet river. That river that supplied them with the salmon that may well have inspired their family coat of arms. And despite being the kings of Ciannachta, the O'Cahans were still bannermen to the powerful O'Neill clan, and thus, as the feudal system dictated, they had to pay their due to their liege lord. This included a yearly tax of cattle, which was the main currency in Ireland at that time, and being ever ready to march into battle with their overlords if they ever went to war, which usually happened in the summer months. Winter was seen as a dishonourable time to fight, as it was the time of storytelling and rest, while the wild winter storms raged outside. Wars were quite a frequent occurrence, as during those times of old, Ireland was a near constant battleground for dozens and dozens of warring clans. John Dorney gives a great description of Gaelic social order in his online article Irish Clans in the 16th Century. He describes how the Gaelic clans had huge households, all descended from a common ancestor. In the case of the O'Cahans, their entire line was formed long ago by a man named Cahan. And due to the size of their families, the question of succession could occasionally be a pretty contentious issue, though the Gaelic chieftains handled things a little differently in that their lord would be chosen and elected by their kin, or their fina. A similar process has been conducted in Ireland for thousands of years, such as how the High Kings of Tara were elected by the Milesians, and the Tuatha De Danann before them, and the Fir Bolg before them. And while this election process could cause infighting within the clans, it was still a rare form of early democracy during those feudal times. A product of the ancient Brehon law system that is amongst the oldest legal systems in the whole of Europe. The Brehons themselves were a well-respected high class in Gaelic society, responsible for upholding law and order, but only after they had studied the Seanchas Mór, the great wisdom, for at least 20 years of their short lives. And their name still lives on today in modern Irish through the word Brehon, which means judge. And much like their liege lords the O'Neills, the O'Cahans' military might consisted in part of a host of swordsmen, the Garm Slua, who were soldiers of the clan. But it also consisted of another class of Irish soldiers called Cairns, who were a bit lower in the social order of the clan than the Garm Slua. They were usually used as bowmen, but did also carry a wooden shield and short blade as well. They were lightly armoured, though this was advantageous as they were far more mobile than the true warriors of the clan. And they would have been used a lot, as wars in Old Ireland often consisted of brief raids and skirmishes. The Gaelic clans were famous for their tactic of striking quickly and vanishing into the dense ancient forests that once enshrouded the land. The northern clans also supplemented their armies with the Galloglass, formidable professional warriors from the Scottish clans of neighbouring Alba. They were effectively paid mercenaries, and as such, their loyalty could be called into question for the right price. The rival clans themselves occasionally allied together against other warring clans, alliances constantly rising and falling like the sun's passage overhead. These military forces were put to the test when the Normans invaded Ireland at the end of the 12th century. Led first by the rebellious knight John de Courcy and then by Hugh de Lacy, the Normans routed the O'Cahans out of the Roe Valley in the early 13th century. They were driven as far as Inishowen following the O'Neill defeat at the Battle of Drumderg near Downpatrick, County Down. The Normans then ruled over most of Ulster for nearly 200 years, building lots of motte and bailey castles and driving the Gaelic chiefs away from their lands and into the dense wolf-infested wilderness of forest. It was during this time that the neighbouring town of Cruithne began to really grow and was by far the most substantial settlement on the north coast at that time. Its Irish name is Culrahan, meaning Nook of the Fern, but it was by no means a new settlement, as the area around Cruithne has been settled for millennia. Archaeologists have found evidence of human activity in Mount Sandal that they reckon is around 9,000 years old. A marvellous motte and bailey castle was also built at Mount Sandal during Norman times, the remains of which you can still visit and walk around today. As such, Cruithne is believed to be the first place that Ulster's earliest people settled at. They rode up the great river Bann that bears the name of an ancient goddess, following the course of the salmon that have known this route far longer than the human newcomers to this island. It has been the hub of human growth and expanse around the north coast for millennia, and Cruithne's influence had grown even more substantially during the Norman occupation. But as it turned out, the Normans' constant expanse deeper into the British Isles was to be their undoing in the end. Well, at least in Ireland anyway. For in 1315 they had a famine and a Scottish rebellion to contend with, one led by none other than Edward the Bruce, brother of Robert, who was King of Scots. He had helped to cripple the Norman power in Ireland, creating a power vacuum in the Ulster kingdoms. After this, the Normans themselves began to assimilate into Gaelic society, with the two peoples beginning to intermarry and share cultural customs. But for the most part, it was the Gaelic chiefs who reclaimed their territories of old following this breakdown of power. Thus, Clan O'Cahan once again came to rule the kingdom of Ciannachta, the lands of Limavady and the Roe Valley. But the Gaelic chiefs did not return to rule in all of Ireland's kingdoms, as was the case with the kingdom of Fearsome and the town of Cruithne, for this land was ruled by Clan McQuillan, who were likely originally of Welsh and Norman descent. Variations of their name can still be seen today in some of the areas around Cruithne, such as the Quilly and adjoining Drummaquill roads. This may just be an anglicisation of the Irish word quilla, meaning woodland, but alternatively it could relate to Clan McQuillan, with Drummaquill possibly translating to McQuillan's Ridge. In this way, their name has been etched into the landscape of Cruithne itself, that land that was once their home. Their name is said to derive from a man named Hugolin de Mandeville, with Hugolin being a diminutive of the Welsh name Hugh. Hugolin had allied with the English in the Norman Conquest of Ireland, and as repayment they had been gifted the barony of Fearsome by the Norman knight Richard de Clare, better known to most as Strongbow. He had appointed them Lords of the Root, an important stretch of territory spanning the North Antrim coast and connecting the towns of Ballycastle and Cruithne. And as Lords of the Root, the McQuillans ruled from the imposing castle at Dunluce, a great stone fortress perched on a basalt seat, overlooking the monstrous waves that pummel the North Antrim coast. It was most likely first built by Richard de Burgh, the second Earl of Ulster in the 13th century. It is now a ruin, as according to legend in 1639, a kitchen on the north side crumbled into the raging sea below. It is said that only a single kitchen boy survived the ordeal, as he was seated on the other side of the room. There is even archaeological evidence suggesting that a small town once huddled around the great castle before it was destroyed by the Irish army during the 1641 Irish Rebellion. But when the McQuillans inherited it, the castle was still in its prime and would serve as their seat of power until the end of the 16th century. And for most of this time, the McQuillans were at constant odds with their neighbours. They fought with local chiefs like the O'Donnells of Donegal, and even those from across the water, like Great Clan MacDonald, those who were lords of the Isles. One great battle with the O'Donnells was fought at Drenna, near Limavady, where among the casualties were Laura O'Donnell and Finn McQuillan. The two were the classic definition of star-crossed lovers, a true Romeo and Juliet of their time. Unfortunately though, their blossoming romance was entangled in the thorns of war, and both fell in the battle. They were buried at Cairnafin in Caherry, alongside the calming waters of the Curly Burn, a small little river that tumbles down behind Benevena Mountain before eventually finding its way into the lower end of the Roe. But few were quite so despised by Clan McQuillan as their immediate neighbours, the O'Cahans of Ciannachta, and vice versa too. They fought many a gruesome battle over the years, reaping a bloody toll on both of their families. One of the most legendary of these encounters has been immortalised in the story of Dogleap, a story which would reach far into the future, long after the old names of O'Cahan and McQuillan had faded away and their kingdoms crumbled. Though it is at this point that we must dive off the precipice of the historical records and into the deep sea of myth and legend that lies below. For the story that I'm about to tell you has very little available information relating to it, save for the most significant plot points. Therefore, I need to say that this is entirely my version of the story and should not be considered a true historical account. Whilst I have borrowed real-life names used by the Gaelic clans included in this story, the characters in my telling are entirely fictitious, as is the name of the wolfhound Díolsha, who we will soon meet, whose name means loyalty in Irish. This is purely my interpretation of how the legend of Dogleap could have come to be, complete with a little storyteller's embellishment, of course, as is the traditional way. Right then, enough rabbiting on. Let's travel back in time to an age long past and find out how Limavady got its name. So it was that one day, a tired troop of warriors were trudging through the wilds of Benevena, low on morale and even lower on supplies. They were led by young Rory O'Cahan, heir to the valley of the Roe. They had been out on a hunt on the trail of a great stag that had so far eluded them. For if you were a Gaelic chief in those days, hunting was the main activity on your mind, besides feasting, storytelling, and warring with your neighbours when you're short of a good story. They all thought hunting was great crack, for in those days Ireland was covered in dense woodland, wild and perilous, nothing like it is now. Most of our trees were cut down during the plantations to build ships and flush the Gaelic chiefs out of their hiding places in the woods. But this was before those days, back when Ireland was one of the most forested countries in Europe instead of one of the least. For the Gaelic clans, the woods were an extension of their home. They knew all of the trees, all of the mushrooms, the plants and animals, and all of the wondrous cures and folk tales that went along with them. The dark, shady, primeval forests of Ireland were their land, and they loved nothing more than trekking their way through it in the pursuit of some great mythical beast that would make Cuchulainn or Fionn McQuillan proud to have slain. Well, at least that was the general idea. But young Rory wasn't the most experienced of hunters, it had to be said. He was a little rash, never taking his time and always firing off impatient, premature shots. He would have been the greatest hunter in Clan O'Cahan had his intended target meant to be the gnarled bough of an oak tree or the slendery, papery trunk of a birch. But unfortunately, this wasn't the case. He was after a great stag, which had been expertly tracked down by Rory's loyal wolfhound, Díolsha. He was a huge, big, hairy creature that seemed almost prehistoric, more akin maybe to a mammoth than a dog. But he was Rory's best friend in the whole world, his most reliable and beloved companion. Together, they had chased this stag halfway across Benevena and were now dangerously close to the McQuillan border. Once again, the stag lifted its great horned head on cue and then dashed off into the woods, throwing up leaves and mud in its wake. It was acutely aware of their presence and seemed to wait until the very last minute before taking off completely unharmed, just for maximum humiliation and ridicule. Damn beast, thought Rory. How could this horrible twig-headed horse still have any energy left in him? We've been chasing him for over an hour now, and I'm bloody starving. And so, reluctantly, Rory bent down to pick up his pack and slung both it and his bow back over his shoulder, as he had done more times than he could count in the last hour and a half or so. The crew pressed on, Rory and a selection of the Garm Slua, the warriors of Clan O'Cahan and friends of the young chiefling. They followed the huge paw prints left by Díolsha as he padded through the undergrowth, on the scent of the stag and paying close attention to the broken branches and fresh hoofprints in the muck. So far, though, the clinging ivy and puncturing brambles that ripped and tore and snagged had done far more damage to Rory than he had done to the stag over the course of the hunt. Suddenly, Díolsha stopped, his ears pricking up, indicating that he could hear something up ahead. Rory told his men to hush up, and he craned his ear to the sound. Initially, he thought it was the stag moving around somewhere in the distance, but no, this was more than that. It was hard to hear at first, but there was definitely more going on out there. Yes, he could hear it now. The distant rustling and crackling was growing louder and seemed to be spreading through the trees, emanating through the dark shade like the disapproving voices of the forest itself. Díolsha began to growl, first an anxious grumble, but then quickly turning into an outright snarl. Rory could now very clearly hear twigs snapping and crunching coming from somewhere in front of him. and even thought he could hear voices. A few scattered, harsh voices barking out commands through the trees. People then. Well, this couldn't be good. Just exactly how far had they strayed onto McQuillan ground at this point? And as if in answer to his question, the oncoming party were now so close that he could actually see shadowy figures moving around in the distance. And he thought that he might have just caught a glimpse of the distinctive red and yellow banner of Clan McQuillan, flickering through the gaps in the trunks like fireflies in a moonlit sky. Behind it, more shadows appeared, what must have been a great moving horde of McQuillan kern advancing through the forest like some ginormous oozing mass, their coloured banners creating the sensation that the forest itself was on fire. Well, that answers that. Perhaps a result of the generational hatred towards the McQuillans that festered within Rory like a parasite. His first thought was to charge into the fray, sword bared just like the old warriors that the bards tell the grandest tales of. But his second thought was a critique of the first one, thinking just how mad of an idea that actually was. He looked behind him at the weary, bramble-slashed dozen or so of Garm Slua warriors that looked really more likely to go for a sleep than to fight an epic battle against their greatest foe. Yeah, he was going to need another plan. And that was right when the third thought entered his mind. One that used quite a lot of colourful language, but essentially boiled down to the simple, easy-to-understand command of run. And luckily, upon seeing the seemingly endless supply of McQuillan kern flooding in towards them through the foliage, the Garm Slua warriors seemed to have been able to find a second wind of sorts. They had no problem at all following Rory's command, and started trying to both leg it in the opposite direction and remain quiet, which wasn't all that easy to do. When they pushed their way through the bushes where they had left their horses, Rory and his company instantly mounted their steeds and galloped off, hard hooves pounding the ground like the beating drums of war. Their destination was the O'Cahan stronghold of the Roe Valley, an old castle nestled deep within the valley's sheltered embrace. They whipped their way through branch and thicket. Oak, ash, rowan, birch all threw up their wooden arms to swat the intrepid warriors off their equestrian torpedoes, but none could do much to slow them. So impressive was their riding ability, so well did they know these woods. This, combined with the acute fear of imminent death at the hands of their worst enemy, unlocked a powerful drive in them. It is a shame they were not competing in the Tailteann Games, what was essentially the Irish version of the Olympics, for such skill and speed as this was truly spectacular to behold. Man and beast became one, two racing heartbeats like centaurs careering through that primeval forest of Ciannachta. And beside them, striding past at lightning speed, was Díolsha, his long legs bounding through the undergrowth, easily clearing any obstacle that appeared before him. Few in Clan O'Cahan could match Díolsha for pace. And as they glided through the trees, Rory could hear faint cries coming from somewhere way off in the distance. But as they drew ever nearer to their home in the valley, he heard them get louder and louder. Terrible screams, shrill shrieks and echoing cries reverberated around the valley, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. There was something horribly abnormal about them. They did not sound real and had an awful heaviness to them, as though the very air itself was weighed down by their presence. His head the closer he got to home, in such a way that he knew they were not the sounds of this world. It was the terrible keening of Granny Roe O'Cahan, the ancestral banshee of Rory's clan. For every Milesian family with Mac or O in their name has a banshee assigned to them, who will wail and weep when one of their own is at death's door. Well, this could not be a good sign at all. And if you want to learn a bit more about the Banshees, check out the video I made about the Banshee of Keble, who is said to haunt the western end of Rathlin Island. Eventually, Granny Roe's cries began to thankfully dissipate and fade as the glistening stony form of O'Cahon's castle came into view, looming over the russet river of Roe like a crown on the landscape itself. The relieved Rory and his weary men rode up the steep slope to their stronghold where his father, Chief Fergal O'Cahon, ruled. He was the very image of a Gaelic chief of old, strong, stocky, built like a fortress himself. Great masses of ginger hair flowed over his shoulders that was matched only by the magnificent beard that erupted out of his jaw. He was a stern man, but loved his son and generally listened to what he had to say. And so Rory told him about what he saw, about the masses of McQuillan men that had trampled over their border and into Benevena, into the kingdom of O'Cahon. Unlike many of the Gaelic chiefs in those days, Fergal was a proud lord who was fiercely protective of his borders. He wasn't about to let McQuillan boots stamp all over his kingdom, sullying his land and destroying his property. And in a strange way, he was sort of glad of this news, for he loved a good battle, any excuse to get his hands dirty and enact bloody warfare on his clan's most hated enemy. So he didn't take too much persuading, and in no time at all he started busying himself, barking out orders to ready his men and prepare for war. They didn't have long, for the McQuillans were making good ground, and so time was of the essence. But luckily for them, the O'Cahon stronghold had the best of the land. It was positioned high up on the pinnacle of one of the valley's steep hills. It was the perfect place to enact a siege defense, which is what they planned to do. And after a few days of preparation, their lookouts spotted something amassing in the trees at night. And when the morning light came, it revealed a host of McQuillan kern lined up at a ford of the Roe, not far from O'Cahon's castle, but painfully out of range of their archers. They looked a formidable sight, all lined up shoulder to shoulder along the riverbanks. It was a substantial host, one of the biggest that Fergal O'Cahon had seen for quite some time. They must have taken almost all of their strength from gun loose, and were clearly not planning on heading back anytime soon. Fergal was outmanned, he knew that, for the sight of the McQuillans gathered there stoked a rage in his heart that he was struggling to quell. Seeing those McQuillan banners planted deep into the banks of the Roe, into the soil of his kingdom, well, it drove him into a frenzy that transcended anger, but was more akin to the battle rage spoken of in the old stories, that of which is feasted on by the Morrigan, the crow-like goddess of war. Be it hubris, madness, or sheer fury, it matters not. The fact was that at that moment, Fergal O'Cahon chose to abandon the safety of his castle and face his enemy right then and there. Rory tried to persuade him not to reason to his better judgment, but Fergal would not have it. In no time at all, he had donned the armour of his ancestors and rallied his men to attack. In all fairness, they did look a terrifying sight. A host of screaming men charging down the valley and towards the ford, led by a great hulking boar of a chief who was brandishing a fearsome-looking sword above his head. But of course, this is just what the McQuillans wanted. Their leader, Lord John McQuillan, knew his rival all too well. Fergal was rash, hot-headed, stubborn, and he knew he wouldn't be able to resist throwing away his defensive advantage in order to meet him out in the open. This would prove to be extremely costly to the O'Cahons, for whilst Fergal had listened to his son for the most part, it had to be admitted that he had not taken in all of what he had to say. Once the McQuillan name had been mentioned, his mind had turned to other things, and he didn't really comprehend the full scale of the invasion. That was until now, when two deafeningly loud cheers erupted out of either side of the banks, and a few moments later, scores upon scores of charging men exploded out of the bushes on the shores of the Roe and charged towards Fergal and his men. But these were no commoner guard in McQuillan Cairn. These were the Gallowglass, hardened, fighting men from Scotland whose entire livelihoods depended on war and bloodshed. They leaped out of the forest from all around towards the exposed O'Cahans, and before too long, Fergal realized that they were trapped. Overhead, the raucous calls of the crows were heard as they flew by, agents and aspects of the Marigny, eager to feast on the battle rage of the fighting warriors and then on the broken bodies of the fallen. It was an ill omen. But still, the spirit of the O'Cahans would not be broken. After all, this was their land. This was their river, their kingdom, and they would fight until their last to protect it. Which they did, bravely cutting down as many McQuillan warriors as they could, but they were slowly being driven out into the river. The currents were slowing them down, making them clumsy and tired. The Gallowglasses had begun their bloody harvest, cutting the O'Cahans down and making that russet river Roe flow bright red with blood. Fergal O'Cahan bravely took down a dozen warriors before he too was cut down and slain by none other than Lord John McQuillan himself. Rory looked on helplessly, watching his father plummet into the river with a great splash as another Gallowglass advanced towards him. He sidestepped and stabbed the warrior through the chest with his sword, and then tripped and fell into the thick undergrowth. He crawled further into the thicket, discombobulated and overcome with grief. He wasn't quite sure what to do, how to lead his men to safety, or even how to survive. He then heard a sharp wail and a horrible, terrifying scream somewhere to his left. He turned his head, and his glazed eyes could just make out a tiny figure crouched at the far bank of the river, frantically washing blood out of a torn O'Cahan banner, which dangled helplessly in the arms of the crone that held it. The blood never seemed to cease. No matter how hard she scrubbed, it stained the blue banner red and dripped down into the river. It merged with the current like a slender, bright red serpent slithering its way downstream to devour the fallen body of Chief Fergal O'Cahan. All around him, shouts, cries, crashes, and wails filled the air, but none cut so harsh as the screams of Granny Roe, shrieking into the chill air on that bloody bank. But at that moment, Díolsha bounded towards Rory, his great snout brushing away the twigs and nudging his master's head to check that he was okay. There was visible relief in the dog's face when he saw Rory look towards him, seemingly unharmed. And as Rory gazed into the eyes of his companion, those dark beads clutched under the long, mottled grey hair of the great dog's head, Rory found a kind of peace. The terror of the battlefield temporarily ceased in his mind. The sounds of screaming swords and howling men all ebbed away, like a sheltered bay on the river that was his home. Díolsha brought comfort, stability, strength, and endurance. He was hope, which is what Rory O'Cahan needed more than ever. And it was then that Rory realized what he needed to do. A piece of tattered parchment. On it, a simple request was then given to Díolsha, who held it in his jaw. Not too hard as to break it, for this was a cry for aid, one which must be carried with both care and haste. Díolsha dutifully accepted his burden from his master, who then buried his hands deep into the dog's coarse fur. He nuzzled his head into that of Díolsha and savoured the comforting warmth that emanated from his body. Rory bid his old friend goodbye, as solemnly as though it could be their final farewell, and the huge dog loped off into the trees. His task was simple, in theory at least: to follow the Red River as it winds its way up the valley to the O'Cahan stronghold at Dungiven. But it was no easy one to execute, for the river would meander for some 9 miles before it reached Dungiven. But no challenge was too great for Díolsha. He would have travelled across the entire length of Ireland, all the way down to Mizzen Head in far-off Kerry if it meant that his clan could be helped. He bounded back up the hill from which Fergal O'Cahan had made his fatal charge, careering through the ferns and shrubs that shot up from the muddy ground before him. In no time at all he had reached the castle, and in less time still he had sprinted past it, a flash of grey amidst a sea of green and brown. He continued along the high road, powering forward as fast as his legs could carry him, before he saw something up ahead. Another large group of McQuillan Kern making the painstaking climb uphill to O'Cahan's castle. They were completely blocking the road, and there were far, far too many of them to run through. Díolsha had no choice. He had to get past them. He had to save Rory, his master and friend, but how? And then it came to him. He saw a clearing ahead on his left, where gorse bushes gave way to empty sky. It was a split-second decision, a slight alteration in his course, and Díolsha pounded his way towards his new target. But he knew this was no mere clearing. This was the capstone of the valley, one of the highest points in the great cliffs that shouldered the river. O'Cahan's Rock, overlooking a narrow gorge where the full scale of the Roe Valley comes into view. A spectacular spot for a picnic and a look around the valley, but not the best option for escaping a horde of ferocious warriors. But still, beggars can't be choosers, and this was the only option that Díolsha could see for himself. This was fate. He had been destined to follow this path up to O'Cahan's highest point in order to bring them salvation in their hour of need. He did not falter for even a second. Faster, faster, gaining ever more speed, he charged, darting between the thorny gorse branches. Quick, nimble, he ducked, weaved his way up the steep slope faster, faster, increasing momentum until the ground suddenly fell away from him as he leaped. Long limbs outstretched to their maximum capacity as the great hairy hound transformed into a diving falcon, an aerodynamic javelin that punctured through the air like an arrow shot true from a bow. Far, far below him was the Roe, a raging mass of white and russet water that called to him, beckoning him towards the abyss below. But still he flew, gliding through the air for what felt like an eternity. The wind seemed to carry him, rustling gently through his fur, elevating him as he soared through the sky. But after he reached the apex of his jump, the irrepressible force of gravity began to pull him down hard and fast, like an enormous hand snatching a tiny fly from the air. Terminal velocity was fast approaching, and his descent was reaching its end. But still, his resolve held true. His stance did not falter, and he plunged through the air just as surely as he had charged up O'Cahan's hill. The other bank was fast approaching, coming towards him with terrifying finality, but he would not be deterred. He readied his feet for landing, stretching his legs far out in front of him before landfall. He quickly worked his legs back towards his body to cushion his impact, catching the earth and pulling it behind him as he landed, following the momentum of his body and using it to propel himself ever forward. Then he realized that he had done it. He had cleared the gorge from its highest point, leaping from O'Cahon's rock and landing clean on the other side. But he did not have long to comprehend it. His legs did not falter for even a second, carrying him ever forwards, leaving the McQuillans way behind him. Spurred on by his miraculous leap, he pounded upstream, never letting the river leave his sight. He did not stop for even a moment's respite, not until he eventually arrived at the stone walls of Dungiven, where he delivered his message into the hands of a confused sentry there. And as he proceeded to unfold and read the letter, Díolsha collapsed onto the ground, absolutely exhausted. He lay there, panting with dehydration, his muscles burning like they were aflame. But he knew that he had done his master proud. He had loyally evaded the McQuillans and done what was surely thought to be impossible. All for the good of his master, his most cherished friend. He had done everything he could to protect him. And now, content in this thought, Díolsha closed his eyes and went for a well-earned sleep. Díolsha had done his master proud. Before long, the full fighting strength of Donal O'Cahan marched from the fortress of Dungiven downstream to their endangered northern cousins. Rory had managed to rally what remained of the broken army of his fathers back to the castle walls, where they had been besieged by the tenacious McQuillans. The O'Cahan successfully held their enemy at bay for a day or so, throwing back assaults from Lord John McQuillan's forces, who showed no signs of backing down. But they were tired, their spirits broken by the loss of their chief and by the seeming inevitability of defeat. They were trapped in their own castle like scared little mice, and the cats would only be kept at bay for so long. But right as the hour seemed at its most dire, a great war horn sounded from the south, carried on the wind to the hapless ears of Rory O'Cahan. And with it came the battle cries of hundreds of men charging, screaming towards them. But not to the castle itself, but into the throng of McQuillans who were camped outside it. The camp, which had minutes ago been a scene of strict military order and precision, devolved into chaos as the blue banner of Donal O'Cahan plunged deep into the throng. The McQuillans were taken completely unawares and were totally unprepared, barely able to draw their swords in time to defend themselves from the ferocious O'Cahans of Dungiven. Within a matter of minutes, they had begun to withdraw, tumbling down the hill and splashing through the river, where they were well and truly routed by their attackers. They hightailed their way back towards Dunluce, clearing the distance just as quickly as Rory O'Cahan and his men had done so in the opposite direction just a few days earlier. Rory could not believe his eyes. In their most desperate hour, when Granny Roe had surely been preparing the death knell of their clan, they had all been saved. Thanks, of course, to the formidable fighting efforts of his kinsman Donal, who had come to their aid without even a second thought, but also to the irrepressible efforts of Díolsha, who had scaled great hills, evaded the McQuillans, and ran tirelessly for miles and miles until he reached those who he knew would save his family. His heroic efforts enabled the salvation of Clan O'Cahan from its most bitter of enemies, and it is through these efforts that this story is remembered. For the area around O'Cahan's Rock, where Díolsha had performed his miraculous jump across raging rapids to clear the River Roe, became known thereafter as Dogleap. And as years and decades came and went, a new town was formed, just a few miles north of O'Cahan's castle, further down the road. A town called Limavady, which would go on to become a centre of linen making and industry in Ciannachta long after the name of O'Cahan drifted away into the mists of time, across the waves to mainland Europe, where the last of the great Gaelic chiefs would die on foreign shores. No, Limavady would live on, to this day still one of the most major settlements on Ireland's most northerly shores. And as with the story of Díolcha, for this has been written into the land, into the foundations of this new town, and into the new stories that blossomed within it, within Limavady, or Leim an Vadi in Irish.